Opening hook. No man will choose you, Amelia. Not with your father's debts. Not with your plain face. Not with that stubborn mouth of yours. Her aunt said those words like a verdict, like a sentence with no appeal. And for 3 years Amelia Ellsworth believed every single one of them. She stood at the edge of every room. She folded herself smaller. She stopped dreaming. Then a landowner who had never once needed anything in his life rode 300 miles through mud and rain and darkness, not for wealth, not for beauty, but for her. If you've ever been told you weren't worth choosing, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel. This story is for you. Amelia Ellsworth had worn her best dress to the Harrington County Assembly. That fact alone told you everything about how little she had left. The gown was pale blue, hemmed twice, pressed that morning in the cold back room of her aunt's townhouse, while the maid watched with an expression that managed to combine pity and contempt in equal measure. Amelia had fixed her own hair. She'd borrowed her aunt's second-best brooch without asking and planned to return it before it was noticed. 3 years of that, 3 years of borrowing and returning and being careful and being quiet and standing at the east wall of every assembly hall in Harrington County while other women filled the floor. Because everyone knew her story. Father died leaving debts. Family name worth less than the paper it was printed on. Living in her aunt's house on her aunt's, which Aunt Millicent reminded her of in 100 small ways every single day, never cruel, never shouted. Just steady and practical and absolutely relentless, the way water is relentless on stone. And every morning the same words over the breakfast table. No man will choose you, Amelia. You have no fortune. You have no beauty that society values, and far too much pride for a woman in your position. The cruelest part wasn't that Millicent said it. The cruelest part was that Amelia had started believing it. Her cousin Charlotte appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of punch, both of which she clearly intended to keep based on how she was holding them. You're doing it again. Doing what? Standing like you're apologizing for existing. Charlotte handed over 1 cup after apparent internal debate. Straighten your spine, at least look like you mean to be here. I don't particularly mean to be here. None of us mean to be here. This is practice. Charlotte's eyes swept the room with the precision of a woman who has been trained since childhood to read social terrain. Mother is watching you. Amelia didn't look. She didn't need to. She could feel Millicent's gaze. The way you feel weather coming, a pressure at the back of the neck, a weight between the shoulder blades. She finds me instructive, Amelia said as a warning. Yes, Charlotte didn't bother softening it. They were past that. She pointed at you twice last week when she wanted to remind me about practical decisions. Amelia absorbed that the way she absorbed everything these days, without visible reaction, just quietly, the way a house absorbs cold through its walls until the cold is everywhere and you've forgotten what warm felt like. The musicians shifted into a reel, the floor filled. Women she'd grown up beside, women who'd been her peers before her father's debts became public knowledge, and the invitations stopped moved into the arms of men who'd offered their hands without being asked twice. She watched the calculations happen in real time, the assessments. The negotiations dressed up as romance. She was not bitter. She told herself she was not bitter. She was still working on believing that. She was on her 3rd cup of punch and debating the headache building behind her left eye when the room changed. Not loudly, just a subtle reorientation of bodies, a ripple of awareness moving across the floor. The specific quality of attention that a room produces when someone unexpected has entered it. She didn't look up. She'd learned not to. Then the footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She looked up. Richard Winthrop was standing before her. Not nearby. Not at an angle. Directly before her. Glass held loosely at his side. Expression attentive in the way of a man who has made a decision and arrived at its conclusion. Charlotte had told her his name 20 minutes ago. He owned half of Winthrop County, possibly more. Nobody was entirely sure where his holdings ended. He'd bought property in Harrington 2 years prior and attended these assemblies rarely and apparently without pleasure. He wasn't looking at the room, he was looking at her. Miss Ellsworth, would you do me the honor of this dance? The entire room waited. She should have said yes immediately. A woman in her position said yes immediately and expressed gratitude and didn't complicate it. 3 people nearby inhaled. Something shifted in his expression. Closer to interest. You want to know why I crossed the room? There are at least a dozen women between where you were standing and where I am. Several have been hoping for exactly this approach all evening. She held his gaze. I'm curious what brought you to this particular wall. 3 full seconds of silence. Because, he said, you were the only person in this room who wasn't watching the door. She stared at him. Everyone else in here is waiting for something. You weren't, you were watching the room. A pause. I found that interesting. That's either a very perceptive observation or a very practiced one. Mr. It's both. He extended his hand. Dance with me. She took his hand. The room exhaled. She felt it as he led her onto the floor, the collective release of held breath, the subtle reconfiguration of attention, the stories already being assembled. She felt Millicent's gaze land on her back like a hand pressing flat. She felt Charlotte's surprise from somewhere to her left. She was calculating the same thing everyone else was. Why her? Richard Winthrop danced the way he wore his coat competently, without considering it the most important thing happening. His hand was firm at her back without being presumptuous. His attention was entirely on her, which was the strangest part. Men who danced with her, those few who asked, looked past her shoulder, or at the room, or at their own social calculations. He looked at her. You know who I am, she said. I know what people say about you. Those are the same thing in this county. No, flat. Certain. What people say about someone is a portrait painted by other people's needs. Who someone actually is takes longer. She studied his face. What do people say about me? That your father died leaving considerable debt. That your family name has limited value. That you live under your aunt's roof at her sufferance. He paused. That you refused 2 offers of employment, despite having no income of your own. The companion position required agreeing with a woman who was wrong about most things. The Bristol school paid less than survival. She kept her voice even. Who told you about those? I asked about you before I came over. That stopped her briefly mid-turn. She recovered. You asked about me specifically? Yes, why? Because I noticed you standing at that wall 40 minutes ago, and spent 40 minutes wondering why a woman who clearly has strong opinions about the room she's in would choose to say nothing. His voice was unhurried. I decided I'd rather ask than keep wondering. The music turned and built around them. She was acutely aware of the room, the watching, the calculating, the stories being assembled in real time. I say nothing, she said, because in my current circumstances, speaking costs more than I can afford. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me at one of these in 3 years of attending them. You've been attending for 3 years. Reluctantly. Something in his expression loosened slightly. Harrington County conducts business through social appearances. I've made my peace with the necessity. You don't look like a man who's made his peace. Professional peace. The personal peace is still pending. He looked at her directly. You look like you've made the professional peace too. Practice. The music slowed toward its end. Mr. Winthrop. She needed to say it before the dance finished, and the moment calcified into something neither of them had agreed to. I appreciate this, genuinely. But I understand what it looks like from the outside, and I don't intend. Miss Ellsworth, quiet. Cutting clean through. I didn't ask you to dance so you'd feel obligated on yourself. Or manage my expectations, a beat, when I asked. Because I wanted to talk to you, the mid. He returned her to the wall, deliberately not abandoning her, walking with her, as though the return was as intentional as the invitation had been. He bowed. Perfectly correct. He didn't leave. I'll be at the Jameson Agricultural meeting Thursday, he said, as though this were the continuation of a conversation they'd already been having. Your family held land in the western fields before the debt sale. She went still. My father's land was sold 4 years ago. I know. Hendrik Cassell purchased it. He's been mismanaging it since, matter of fact. Not cruel. Just accurate. There's a drainage issue on the lower field that'll cost him 3 harvests if it isn't addressed. I've been trying to tell him for 6 months. The lower field always had a drainage issue. The words came out before she decided to say them. My father diverted the Creel stream through a secondary channel in 1809. It worked 6 years before the channel silted. You'd need to re-establish it further east, maybe 20 feet. Richard Winthrop looked at her for a long moment. How do you know that? Because that was my father's land, she said, and I grew up on it. Something shifted in his face. Recognition. The particular quality of a man who has been looking for something and has just found it in an unexpected place. Thursday. The Jameson meeting, 10 o'clock. He walked away. Millicent appeared at Amelia's elbow within 30 seconds. She had clearly started moving before he'd fully turned. It wasn't a question. Good evening, Aunt. Amelia. Millicent's voice carried the weight of controlled alarm. Richard Winthrop does not single out women at assemblies. He does not dance with women he hasn't been introduced to. People are already talking. They were already talking before he crossed the room. They were talking about your situation. Now they're talking about his interest. Millicent's eyes were sharp and certain. Those are entirely different conversations. He wanted information about the western fields. Agricultural information. Amelia picked up a fresh cup of punch from a passing tray. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. It was a practical exchange. Millicent stared at her. He asked you about agriculture. He did. Richard Winthrop, who owns thousands of acres and employs dozens of land managers, asked you about a drainage problem. Apparently I knew something his managers didn't. She sipped her punch. It happens. A long pause. Millicent was calculating. Amelia could see it, the rapid, efficient arithmetic of a woman who had spent decades managing social outcomes. Do not build anything on this. Her voice dropped lower, which was more serious than raised would have been. A dance and a conversation about drainage is not what it looks like. I'm not building anything, you are. I can see it in your face. Amelia turned to face her aunt fully. Millicent was a handsome woman who had made a practical marriage and never stopped being grateful for its practicality. She genuinely believed she was protecting Amelia. Amelia genuinely believed she was being slowly erased. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. What does my face look like? Amelia asked. Millicent paused. And in that pause, something flickered, something softer than calculation quickly covered. Like someone who just remembered she exists. Amelia said nothing. That's the dangerous part, Millicent said, not unkindly. When you start remembering you exist, you start wanting things again. And wanting things in your position is a luxury I cannot afford. Amelia finished it for her. I know. She found Charlotte and spent the rest of the evening doing what women in their position did, watching, calculating, saying the correct small things to the correct people. She did not check the door once. She didn't need to. He'd already arrived. Thursday arrived before she'd fully decided what to do about it. The Jameson agricultural gathering was held in the back rooms of Jameson's feed supply men, who owned land or managed it or hoped to, gathered to argue about crop rotation and drainage and seed costs. Women did not attend. This had never been stated as a rule, because it had never needed to be stated, the same way you don't post a sign telling the river which direction to run. Amelia stood outside the door for 20 minutes. Then she walked in. 11 men turned to look at her. The room smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the particular anxiety of people who worry about weather. Richard saw her the moment she stepped through. Something in his posture settled the resolution of a calculation he'd been running. Miss Ellsworth. His voice carried across the room without effort. Come in, Castle. Give her your seat. Castle, stout, red-faced, a man who had never enjoyed being told what to do in his life, looked between them with profound grievance. That ain't exactly standard procedure for a... No, Richard agreed pleasantly. It isn't. Give her the seat. Cassell gave her the seat. Amelia sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at 11 men looking at her. I understand there's a drainage issue in the lower western fields, she said. For the next 2 hours, she was the most useful person in the room. Cassell argued with her for the first 40 minutes. He was not a bad man, just a man who didn't enjoy being corrected in front of other men by a woman who held no land. She answered him precisely and without visible irritation, which she suspected aggravated him considerably more than anger would have. By the end, 3 men had asked for her recommendations in writing. She walked out into the late morning and stood on the steps, trying to identify the feeling moving through her. It had been so long since she'd felt it that she'd nearly forgotten its shape. She felt useful. Richard came out behind her. He stood beside her, and for a moment neither spoke. You knew they'd listen, he said finally. I hoped. There's a difference. You were right about the diversion. I had a surveyor walk it after the assembly. He agrees. Of course he agrees. I watched my father build the original. Castle won't implement it for 3 months. He's stubborn. He'll implement it when the April flooding does exactly what I said it would, and he has to explain the shortfall to his investors. She paused. Then he'll tell everyone he thought of it himself. A sound came from beside her brief, unguarded reel. A laugh. 3 people on the street turned to look. He didn't seem to notice. Probably said, "That's fine. The field gets fixed. That's what matters." He turned to look at her properly. She felt it without turning back. "Why does it matter to you? It's Castle's field now. There are 7 tenant families on that land. They were there when it was my father's land. The flooding will damage their kitchen gardens and their root cellars. 2 of those families have children who were sick last winter." She watched a cart negotiate the mud below. "The field belongs to Castle. The people on it are still people." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. "You still visit them," he said. "The tenant families. I visit Mrs. Briggs's youngest, whose cough has lasted longer than it should. I've been teaching Hennessy's oldest boy his letters on Thursday afternoons when I can manage the walk." "You're teaching a tenant farmer's son to read. He wants to learn." That seemed like sufficient reason. Another silence. Different in quality from the first, Miss Ellsworth. A shift in his voice, more deliberate. "Why are you still here in Harrington? At your aunt's house? You have more capability than most men I pay to advise me. Why are you He paused, selecting the word waiting. The question had weight. She'd been asking herself a version of it in the quiet of her room for months. "Because leaving requires knowing where you're going," she said. "And every option I've been offered would require me to become smaller than I already am." "What kind of option would let you stay the same size?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, because saying it aloud felt like reaching in the dark, and she didn't yet know if her hand would find something solid or close on empty air. "Think about it," he said. Not pressing. Just leaving the question where she could find it later. Then Charlotte appeared with a look that meant they were leaving in 5 minutes, and after the conversation ended, and Amelia went home and lay awake thinking about what kind of option let a woman stay exactly the size she was. She didn't find an answer that night. But she found that for the first time in 3 years, she was asking the question like someone who believed an answer existed. That was its own kind of beginning. The paper she'd written on was still wet when Millicent knocked on her door that evening. Amelia covered it with her elbow before she thought about why she was hiding it, and that instinct alone told her something. You don't hide things from people who make you feel safe. Supper in 10 minutes. Millicent's voice came through the wood, flat and even. And Mrs. Whitmore wrote that the position must be decided by the end of the month. Amelia looked at the paper beneath her elbow. Drainage calculation. Stream diversion angles. The particular elevation of the northeast corner of a field that no longer belonged to anyone she loved. "I heard you, Aunt." Footsteps moving away down the hall. She lifted her elbow. The ink had smudged slightly where her sleeve pressed against it, but the numbers were still legible. She had filled 3 pages without meaning to, and the writing had the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to get out. She folded the pages carefully. She put them in the small box she kept under the floorboard at the back of her wardrobe, where she kept the other things that were hers and only hers, a letter from her father, written 2 weeks before he died. A pressed sprig of lavender from the garden of the house they'd lost, and a small notebook in which she had, over 3 years, recorded the names and circumstances of every tenant family on the western land, along with notes on their children and their crops, and the particular small disasters that had visited them each season. She locked the box. She went down to supper. Charlotte was there, and Charlotte's younger brother Thomas, and Millicent's friend Mrs. Adcroft, who had a talent for arriving exactly when Amelia least wanted company. The conversation moved through the usual channels: the assembly, the weather, the price of wool, the engagement that was reportedly forming between Miss Pemberton and the younger Ashworth, and Amelia ate her soup and contributed the correct small remarks at the correct intervals and thought about drainage and about the way Richard Winthrop had said you've been standing at the edge of the wall so long you've forgotten you don't have to stay there, and about how a man she'd spoken to twice had somehow managed to locate the specific thing she'd stopped letting herself think about. Mr. Winthrop was at the Jasmison meeting this morning, Mrs. Adcroft announced, to no one in particular, in the way of someone who absolutely means to say it to someone in particular. Millicent looked up from her bread. "I heard he asked about the old Ellsworth Western fields, Mrs. Adcroft's eyes moved to Amelia, with the careful casualness of a woman who has been waiting all evening for this moment. specifically about the drainage issue. Thomas, who was 17 and interested only in horses, continued eating. Charlotte went very still. Agricultural matters, Amelia said. He mentioned it at the assembly. He mentioned it to you at the assembly, Mrs. Adcroft's tone was light enough to be called innocent. It wasn't. And you attended the Jameson meeting this morning, didn't you, Amelia? Charlotte saw you coming back from that direction. The table achieved a particular kind of silence that Amelia recognized, the silence of multiple people deciding simultaneously whether to say what they were thinking. Millicent broke it. You went to the Jameson meeting. I have information about the Western land, Amelia said. Information that's relevant to a drainage problem that will cost Cassell 3 harvests if it isn't solved. I provided that information. 3 men asked for my recommendations in writing. You are not a land manager, Amelia? No. I'm the person who knows that land better than anyone currently responsible for it. She set her spoon down. I'm not sure how that's a problem. It's a problem, Millicent said. And her voice had gone to that particular register, not raised. Never raised. Just waited because Richard Winthrop specifically invited you to that meeting. And you went. And now every person in Harrington County who saw you there is constructing a story that has very little to do with drainage. Let them construct their stories. The field still needs fixing. Amelia. Charlotte's voice was quiet, different from her mother's. Are you being careful? Amelia looked at her cousin. Charlotte's expression had none of Mrs. Adcroft's calculation in it. Just genuine concern, the kind Charlotte reserved for things she actually worried about. I'm being practical, Amelia said. Those aren't the same thing. She knew they weren't. The following 2 weeks moved differently than any 2 weeks had moved in a long time. Richard Winthrop did not write to her. That would have been improper. And he was, beneath the unconventional surface, a man who understood where the lines were. But he appeared, at the Hartley seed discussion as he'd mentioned. At the county magistrate's open session, where Amelia had gone to listen to a dispute over boundary lines because the boundary in question abutted the western field's eastern edge. At a small gathering at the Reverend Morton's home, which Amelia attended with Charlotte, and where Richard arrived late and left early and somehow managed to spend 40 minutes in the same rooms as her without it appearing to be intentional. It was entirely intentional. She was not fooled. She didn't think she was meant to be. What surprised her was what they talked about. He asked questions that nobody asked her. Not questions designed to assess her suitability or her connections or her opinion on fashionable subjects. Questions about what she knew. About the tenant families and their situations. About the flooding history of the lower fields. About the particular mathematics of crop rotation on clay-heavy soil. About what she thought should be done. About the seed pricing monopoly that 3 merchants in Harrington had quietly established, making it functionally impossible for small farmers to stay solvent without going into debt. You know about that? He had that tone he sometimes got, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. They were standing near the bookshelves at the Reverend Morton's gathering, which placed them technically in the same area as the rest of the party while being effectively separate from it. Mr. Hennessy told me. He's been paying Caldwell's prices for 3 seasons because Caldwell and the 2 Marsh brothers decided there was no reason to compete when they could cooperate. She kept her voice low. Not secretive, just calibrated for the room. The small farmers have nowhere else to go. The larger estate holders buy in volume through London connections. It's the people in the middle who are being crushed. What would you do about it? I'd import through Newcastle and undercut Caldwell's price by 12%, which is the exact amount you can absorb without running at a loss given Newcastle's current wholesale rate. She paused. I did the arithmetic last year when Mr. Hennessy first told me. I had no way to act on it. Someone with a Newcastle connection and sufficient capital could. Richard was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than casual. You calculated a Newcastle import margin, he said. I was passing the time. By doing agricultural economics. I don't embroider. The sound that came out of him then was unmistakably a laugh. Brief, unguarded, real. 3 people across the room turned to look. He didn't seem to notice. Or he noticed and decided it wasn't the most important thing happening. I have a Newcastle connection, he said. You mentioned the northern origins of your family's holdings at the Jameson meeting. You remembered that. I remember most things. She said it simply without apology. It was true. It had always been true. She had spent 3 years in rooms where nobody was particularly interested in what she knew and had gone on, knowing it anyway, accumulating it, storing it in the careful archive of her mind, because there was nowhere else to put it. Miss Ellsworth. His voice shifted not lower but more deliberate. Why are you still here? She looked at Ins. Charlotte wanted to come. In Harrington. At your aunt's house. You've been there 3 years. You clearly have more capability than most men I pay to advise me. Why are you He paused, choosing the word waiting. The question sat in the air between them. It was the right question. She'd been asking it of herself in the quiet of her room for months. And the honest answer had layers she wasn't ready to offer to a man she'd known for 2 weeks. Because leaving requires knowing where you're going, she said finally. And every option I've been offered would require me to become a smaller version of myself than I already am. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, what kind of option would let you stay the same size? She didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because saying it out loud felt like reaching for something in the dark, and she didn't yet know if her hand would find it or close on empty air. Think about it, he said. Not pressing. Just leaving the question where she could find it later. Then Charlotte appeared at Amelia's elbow with a look that meant they were leaving in 5 minutes whether Amelia was ready or not, and the conversation ended. And Amelia went home and lay awake, thinking about what kind of option would let her stay the same size and whether any such option existed. It was 11 days after Morton's gathering that she discovered the ledger. She found it by accident, the way the most consequential things tend to be found. She'd been looking for the household receipt book Millicent had sent her to find it from the study, where Millicent kept her private accounts and business papers in the large locked cabinet beside the desk. The receipt book was kept separately on a small shelf near the window. Amelia went to get it. The ledger was on the desk, open, which was not normal. Millicent was not a careless woman. In 3 years of living in this house, Amelia had never once seen her aunt leave anything of significance accessible, which meant she had been interrupted before she could close it, or she had left it open deliberately, or Amelia was not supposed to be in this room at this hour, and Millicent had not expected her. She should have taken the receipt book and left. She looked at the ledger. The handwriting was her aunt's. She knew it as well as she knew her own. 3 years of correspondence and household accounts having made it familiar. The columns were neat, the numbers precise, the dates running back 18 months in neat quarterly entries. But the column headers made no sense to her. Trust account, quarterly disbursement. She stood very still. E. Ellsworth, her father's initials, her initials. She picked up the ledger. Her hands were steady, because she made them steady, the same way she'd made them steady at the assembly and the Jameson meeting, and at every moment for 3 years when her hands had wanted to shake, and she'd decided they wouldn't. The numbers were not small. Quarterly disbursements from an account titled Ellsworth Estate Trust, running back 18 months each one, directed to a second account, whose identifier she didn't recognize. The amounts varied, some larger, some smaller, but the cumulative total across 18 months was enough to make her vision blur slightly at the edges. She put the ledger down. She picked up the receipt book. She walked out of the study and closed the door behind her and went to the kitchen to deliver the receipt book to Cook. And she stood in the kitchen for 3 full minutes doing nothing, while Cook talked about the price of butter. And she listened to every word about butter and says nothing at all. There had been a trust. Her father had left a trust. She had been told Millicent had told her, and the solicitor Millicent had arranged, a man named Drummond who smelled of pipe smoke and had never once looked directly at her, that her father's debts had consumed everything, that there was nothing, that she came to Millicent's house empty-handed, and that Millicent had taken her in out of family obligation and Christian decency. Those words, nothing, empty-handed, obligation, had become the foundation on which she'd built everything she believed about her own position. If those words were wrong, if the foundation was wrong. She went upstairs. She sat on her bed. She did not cry because crying felt like something that should wait until she understood what she was crying about. She needed to see those account records, not just the one ledger page she'd glimpsed all of it. She needed to know who was receiving those disbursements and under what authority, and why a solicitor named Drummond had told her. There was nothing when there was apparently something. She needed help. The kind of help that required legal knowledge and connections and the ability to make inquiries that a woman alone with no standing could not make. She spent 2 days considering it. On the third day, she wrote a note. Not to Richard. Writing directly to him was still a step she wasn't ready to name as what it was. She wrote to Thomas Fairley, who had attended the Jameson meeting and who had a brother who practiced law in Harrington, and she asked if Mr. Fairley could arrange a brief conversation about a matter related to the western field drainage, which was true and also functionally meaningless as a cover story. Thomas Fairley responded the next morning and told her his brother Gerald was available Thursday. Gerald Fairley was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the harried look of a man who handles other people's crises for a living and has absorbed some of each crisis along the way. He listened to her with his hands folded on his desk and an expression of such complete professional neutrality that she couldn't tell if he believed her or was simply too well trained to show that he didn't. She told him what she'd seen. She gave him the numbers. She'd memorized all of them, every figure from that open ledger, which she'd spent the subsequent 2 days reconstructing from memory with the same precision she brought to crop rotation calculations. When she finished, Gerald Fairley unfolded his hands. Miss Ellsworth. He was choosing his words with the care of someone navigating a riverbed by feel. Are you certain of these figures? I have a very accurate memory. An Ellsworth estate trust would have been established at your father's death by his solicitor. Who? Man named Drummond. He was arranged by my aunt. Gerald Fairley made a small sound that wasn't quite a word but communicated something. Drummond and Associates handled several estates in this county over the past decade. There were questions raised about his practices 3 years ago. The inquiry didn't proceed. He paused. There was insufficient evidence to compel it. Misallocation. Misdirection of funds. The particular kind of creative accounting that looks like error until you look at the pattern of it. He met her eyes. Miss Ellsworth, what I'm telling you is that if what you saw in that ledger is accurate, the matter is considerably more serious than a clerical discrepancy. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. I need to know if there's a legal path to seeing the full accounts. For the ward of an estate, there are avenues. The problem is standing your standing to make the inquiry. Drummond's firm would contest your right to request an audit on the grounds that the estate was fully administered at the time of your father's death. You'd need to demonstrate the trust's existence through independent records. Where would those records be? The trust would have been registered. County court or ecclesiastical if your father was Church of England. He hesitated. The registrations are public record. A sufficiently motivated inquiry could locate them. I'm sufficiently motivated, that's evident. He looked at her for a moment. Miss Ellsworth, this kind of inquiry, if it's pursued, will make people uncomfortable. Specifically, the people who are currently comfortable with the existing arrangement. My aunt. He didn't confirm or deny. He was too professional. But he didn't have to. She walked back to Millicent's house under a sky that had gone the pale gray of late afternoon, and she thought about the woman who had taken her in, who had fed her and housed her and told her, in 100 variations, that she was worth nothing, who had looked at her every day for 3 years knowing that a trust existed, who had spent those disbursements, or directed them somewhere while her niece folded and pressed her own dress for assemblies and borrowed brooches without asking. The anger that moved through her was clean and cold, like the Creel stream in early spring. Not hot, not shaking, cold and very clear. She was still standing in this house when she got home. Still folding herself small, still performing the gratitude that had been the price of the roof and the meals and the instruction in practical realities. But she was done believing it was all she deserved. Richard found out 4 days later. She didn't tell him. She had not yet decided how much to tell him, or when or what it would mean to say, I think my aunt has been taking money that belongs to me to a man who was not family, and was not. She still hadn't fully named what he was. He found out because Gerald Fairley, in the process of locating the trust registration at the county court, crossed paths with another inquiry that had been running parallel to hers without her knowledge. Richard's inquiry. He appeared at the door of Millicent's house on a Tuesday morning. Not the back entrance. The front door. He knocked and gave his name to the maid with the full weight of his presence, which meant Millicent herself came to answer it rather than sending anyone else. Amelia was at the top of the stairs when she heard his name spoken. She came down. He was standing in the entrance hall. His coat was travel-dusted, which meant he'd come directly from somewhere rather than from home. He looked at her over Millicent's shoulder, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not quite urgency, but adjacent to it. Millicent turned to look at Amelia. Her face was very carefully arranged. Mr. Winthrop wishes to speak about the agricultural inquiry. Yes, Amelia said, he may use the front sitting room. Millicent's careful arrangement cracked slightly. Amelia, the front sitting room, Amelia repeated. And she was surprised by the sound of her own voice, how level it was. How certain. You may join us if you wish, Aunt. Millicent did not join them. The door of the front sitting room closed, and they were alone. And Richard turned to face her and said without preamble, Gerald Fairley told me about the county court registration. He told you. She held herself very still. Not intentionally. We were both there. He was locating a trust registration. I've been running a separate inquiry into Drummond's firm for the past 6 weeks. Different matter, same pattern. He looked at her steadily. Miss Ellsworth, how long have you known about the trust? 8 days. He stopped, started again. You had no reason to come to me. No, I didn't. She held his gaze. You had no obligation to investigate Drummond. I have tenants who were impacted by his misallocations on other estates. I have reasons of my own. He paused. But finding your name in the registration records, I need to know how much you know and how far you've gotten. She told him. All of it. The ledger. The figures. The conversation with Gerald. The pattern of quarterly disbursements to the unidentified secondary account. She told it the way she told things, precisely, without elaboration, every number accurate. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had noticed about him. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then the secondary account is Drummond's operating account. He's been routing funds through it with a delay structure that obscures the origin. It's the same method he used on at least 2 other estates we've identified. Amelia's chest tightened. We're not certain yet. Minimum 2 that we can document. Possibly 5. He met her eyes. Your trust was not small. The registration shows a figure that would have provided you with a reasonable income independent of anyone's household. She said nothing. Independent, he repeated carefully. For at least 15 years at the rate of disbursement, before the principal was exhausted. The silence in the room had weight. 3 years. 3 years of borrowed brooches and folded dresses, and no man will choose you, and being arranged like a problem toward a solution in Bristol. 3 years of standing at the edge of walls, because she had been told and had believed that she had nothing. She had not had nothing. She had had something, and something had been removed. I need to see the full accounts, she said. Gerald's filing a petition. It'll take 6 weeks, possibly 8 for a hearing. Who's the magistrate? She calculated. Ashworth bought 2 of his eastern parcels through Castle, who got them through a Drummond-administered sale. He has a conflict. Richard looked at her. How do you know that? Told you. I remember things. She met his eyes. Ashworth can't hear this case. We need to petition for reassignment to the circuit magistrate. He was quiet for a moment. The word sat in the air between them. She heard it. She felt it. She didn't reach for it quite yet, because reaching felt like something she needed to do carefully. The petition, she said. It would be stronger with supporting documentation from additional affected estates. I have 2 of those. Then you have reason to be involved. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing something she was beginning to recognize, that slight recalibration, that quality of a man revising a conclusion he'd thought was final. Miss Ellsworth, he said. Mr. Winthrop, you should know that I came here this morning without a plan beyond telling you what I'd found. I didn't have a legal strategy. I didn't have a petition timeline. I didn't have a conflict of interest analysis on the sitting magistrate. I know, you had all of those things before I walked through the door. I've had 8 days to think. He took a breath, let it out. What do you need from me? It was a different question than she'd expected. Not what can I do, the offer of a man extending help from above. What do you need from me? A question that placed her at the center of the thing, that treated her not as the recipient of assistance but as the person directing it. She felt something unlock in her chest. Small. Careful. Access to your documentation on the other estate, she said. Gerald will need it for the petition. And your Newcastle connection, if we can demonstrate that Drummond's misdirected funds were reinvested through the Northern Merchant Network, it establishes intent rather than error. He nodded. I'll get you the documentation by Thursday. The Newcastle records will take longer. My contact there will need to locate the relevant transfers. I can wait a week. And in the meantime? In the meantime, she said, I need to decide what to do about my aunt. The question of Millicent sat in the room like a third person. Richard didn't offer an opinion on that. He had the sense to understand it wasn't his to offer. Is she aware that you know? He asked. I don't think so. She left the ledger open by accident. She's been entirely normal since, which with my aunt means careful and controlled and watchful. Amelia looked toward the door. She's not a bad woman. She took money that belonged to you. Or she knew it was being taken and did nothing. She paused. Which might be worse, or might be more complicated. I don't know yet. She looked back at him. I'm not asking for your judgment on her. I know. His voice was quiet. I'm sorry you're having to hold this alone. The simplicity of it, no solution offered, no action proposed, just acknowledgement of the weight did something to the tightness in her chest that she hadn't expected. She had to look away for a moment. I've been holding things alone for 3 years, she said. I'm practiced. Being practiced at something doesn't mean it shouldn't be otherwise. She looked at him again. He was looking at her steadily, the way he always looked at her directly, without the sideways quality that most men brought to conversations with women they were assessing, the glancing quality of people who don't want to be caught looking. Why did you come this morning? She asked. You could have sent a note through Gerald. He was quiet for a moment. Because it was your name on the registration, he said. And I thought you should hear it from a person, not a letter. She sat with that Thursday. For the documentation, she said finally. On Thursday. He moved toward the door. Stop, Miss Ellsworth. The agricultural meeting at Caldwell's next week, the one about the seed pricing. I heard about it. You should be there. I wasn't invited. You're invited now, he said it simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. You know more about the economics of this situation than anyone else who will be in that room. Caldwell is going to try to justify his pricing structure, and someone needs to be there who can dismantle it accurately and publicly. He looked at her. That's you. She thought of the months she'd spent doing arithmetic in the margins of household account books because it was the only mathematics she was permitted. She thought of Gerald Fairley's expression when she'd given him the ledger figures from memory. She thought of 11 men at the Jameson meeting, and the particular look on Cassell's face when he realized she knew more than he did about his own land. She thought of standing at the edge of the wall. I'll be there, she said. He nodded. He let himself out of the front sitting room. She heard him say something brief to Millicent in the entrance hall, formal, correct, nothing that could be questioned, and then the front door opened and closed. Millicent appeared in the doorway of the sitting room 30 seconds later. Agricultural matters, she said. Yes, you're going to the Caldwell meeting. How did you know about that? Because Richard Winthrop's voice carries, and your house has walls that don't. Millicent's expression was unreadable. What are you doing learning? The size of the room, Amelia said. She walked past her aunt and up the stairs. And she went to her room. And she took out the small box from under the floorboard. And she added a new page to the notebook. Tenton family records this time. But a careful accounting of what she now knew, organized by date and figure and implication, building the architecture of something that had been hidden from her for 3 years, and was now, piece by piece, becoming visible. She worked until the candle burned down. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time in 3 years, something much better than afraid. She was ready. Part 3, the journey of 300 miles. The Caldwell meeting was on a Wednesday. Amelia knew she was ready when she walked through the door and felt nothing except the particular sharp clarity that comes when you stop performing calm and actually have it. 12 men this time. Caldwell himself at the head of the table, a thick-necked man with the practiced confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. His 2 partners, the Marsh brothers, flanked him like punctuation. Gerald Fairley sat near the middle, which surprised her until she remembered that Richard had mentioned the petition would benefit from visible legal presence. Richard was already there. He didn't look at her when she entered, or rather, he looked at her in the way that registers, and then deliberately doesn't advertise that it has registered. A small precision. She appreciated it. Caldwell looked at her directly. This is a private commercial discussion, Miss Ellsworth. She took the empty chair between Gerald and a farmer named Briggs, whose brother was one of the tenants she'd been visiting on Thursday afternoons for 2 years. I'm aware of what it is. Women don't. I have the current Newcastle wholesale rate for primary grain seed. The Bristol and Liverpool alternatives. Your last 3 seasons of Harrington County pricing structure. And a calculation of the margin differential that explains exactly why your prices are where they are. She set her notebook on the table. If you'd prefer I leave, I'll take those numbers with me. But I suspect you'd rather I stay and we discuss them here than have them appear in a petition document next month. Caldwell's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, irritation, calculation, and finally the particular stillness of a man who has realized he needs to reassess. Not graciously, but he said it. What followed was 2 hours of the most precise technical and frankly satisfying conversation Amelia had ever sat in the middle of. She laid out the pricing structure the way you lay out evidence, not accusation, just arithmetic. Caldwell tried to counter 3 times with arguments that sounded substantial until she answered each one with a specific figure that made it collapse. The Marsh brothers stopped trying after the first hour. By the end, there were 6 men in the room who had pulled out their own notebooks and were copying down her Newcastle calculation. Briggs leaned over to her as the meeting broke up. My brother mentioned you'd been teaching his boy letters. That's true? Thursday afternoons when I can manage it. Briggs looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. My brother didn't know you were doing this kind of work too. He didn't need to know. He needed his boy to learn to read. Briggs nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then there's more folks than Caldwell who've been squeezing the small farmers. You know that, I know. And you've been keeping track. It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. I've been keeping track. He nodded again. The way men nod when they've made a decision. And then he went to speak to Gerald. And Amelia watched them talking and thought that sometimes the most important things begin in rooms nobody expected them to begin in. Richard appeared at her elbow after the last man had filed out. Caldwell had already gone quickly, which told her something about the state of his thinking. You had that Newcastle figure memorized, I told you. I do arithmetic when I have time. She closed her notebook. The petition document will be stronger with Caldwell's pricing records attached. He won't volunteer them. Gerald can compel them through the circuit magistrate if the Ashworth conflict is confirmed. He paused. It was confirmed this morning. Ashworth is recused. Circuit Magistrate Holloway will hear the case in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She ran the timeline in her head, the documentation he was gathering. The Newcastle records. The Drummond account trail. The Ashworth recusal. The registration records Gerald had already located. 6 weeks felt simultaneously like too long and not long enough. There's something else. His voice shifted into the register she'd come to associate with information he was deciding how to deliver. The secondary account, the one receiving Drummond's misdirected disbursements. Gerald's contact at the county court found the account holder. She was very still. Who? It was opened in Drummond's name. But the authorized signatory for withdrawals, he paused, is your aunt. The room was empty now except for the 2 of them. The morning light came through the windows at an angle that cast long shapes across the floor. She was aware of the light. She was aware of Richard standing beside her. She was aware of the sound of her own breathing, which remained steady because she decided it would. She knew, Amelia said. She signed for the withdrawals herself, quarterly, for 18 months. 18 months. That was how long the ledger had been running. But her father had died 3 years ago, which meant she calculated the first 12 months of disbursements had gone somewhere else, or had been held differently, or had been managed by Drummond alone before Millicent's direct involvement began. In the first year, she said quietly, before she was a signatory. We don't have those records yet. The Newcastle connection may help trace them. He looked at her carefully. Miss Ellsworth. I'm fine. I know you are. I'm not asking if you're fine. I'm asking if you want a moment. She looked at him. His expression had none of the careful professional neutrality she'd seen on Gerald's face. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, directly, honestly, without managing the look into something more comfortable. She told me every day. Amelia said slowly that I had nothing. That I was nothing, not in those words, but in every practical implication of the words she did use. And she knew. She stopped. Started again. She looked at me every single day and said there was no future for me and made me feel grateful for the roof over my head. Richard said nothing. He let her say it without rushing toward a response. The worst part, she continued, and her voice was still steady, which was the thing she would remember later how steady it was even then, is that I'm not certain she thought of it as theft. I think she genuinely considered herself the practical administrator of a situation my father had failed to manage responsibly. I think she told herself she was being reasonable. That doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. She looked down at her notebook on the table. But understanding it means I don't have to hate her to get through it. And I'd rather not hate her. It would take too much energy I need for other things. A short silence. That, Richard said quietly, is one of the most clear-headed things I've ever heard anyone say about being wronged. She picked up her notebook. Sentiment doesn't fix the drainage on Castle's Field either. Shall we go over the Newcastle timeline? He laughed, a real one, not the brief contained sound from Morton's gathering. Fuller. Warmer. She did not let herself notice how different her chest felt when he laughed. She allowed herself to notice it a little. The next 3 weeks built toward the circuit, hearing the way a river builds toward a falls, gathering speed, gathering weight, the surface calm but the undercurrent moving with increasing urgency. Gerald filed the amended petition with the supporting documentation from Richard's files. The Drummond inquiry, which had begun as a quiet investigation into 2 other estates, expanded when Briggs's brother connected them to a 3rd case and then a 4th. The Newcastle records arrived and were, as Amelia had suspected, revelatory. The reinvestment trail through the Northern Merchant Network was detailed enough to establish clear intent rather than error, which was precisely the distinction that would determine whether this was a civil recovery or something considerably more serious. She spent most of her days at Gerald's office now, working through documents, organizing the evidence structure, building the factual argument that would go before Holloway. Gerald had stopped looking at her like a client somewhere around the 2nd week and started looking at her like a colleague, which she found satisfying in a way that was hard to articulate. She also spent considerable time pretending at home that none of this was happening. This was the most difficult part. Coming back to Millicent's house every evening. Sitting at supper, answering questions about her day with the careful half-truths she had learned from 3 years of practice at being small. Watching her aunt cut her meat and ask Charlotte about the Ashworth engagement and tell Thomas to sit up straight. And knowing, sitting with the full knowledge of what Millicent had done while performing the normal transactions of their shared life. Charlotte noticed. "You're different," Charlotte said one evening, catching Amelia in the upstairs hallway after supper. Charlotte had developed the instinct, over years of living in the same house, for when things were not what they appeared to be. "I've been busy." "I know you've been busy. You're always busy." "But you're different." Charlotte studied her. "You're not afraid anymore." Amelia looked at her cousin. In the narrow hallway with the candle throwing long shadows, Charlotte looked younger than she usually did, looked the way she'd looked years ago, before the assembly circuit and the social calculations had settled over her like a second face. Charlotte. She chose her words carefully. "If you knew that something your mother had done was wrong, not in the way of a mistake, but deliberately wrong, what would you do?" Charlotte went very still. "I would want to know first," Charlotte said slowly. She paused. "Amelia." "Not yet. I'll tell you when I can." "You'll tell me before—" Charlotte stopped herself. "Before whatever is happening becomes something I have to find out from someone else." "Yes." Charlotte held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went to her room. And Amelia stood in the hallway alone and thought that of all the losses this situation might produce, losing Charlotte would be the one that cost her most. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days before the circuit hearing. It was not from Drummond, who had gone very quiet since the amended petition was filed. It was not from Caldwell, who had sent 2 letters to Gerald that were professional in language and unmistakably threatening in implication. It was not from the circuit court. It was from Millicent. Not given to her, left in her room, on her pillow. In her aunt's handwriting, sealed. Amelia sat on the edge of her bed and held it for a moment before she opened it. "Amelia." I know what you have found. Have known for 2 weeks that you found it. I am not writing to explain myself. I am writing because I think you deserve to hear certain things from me before you hear them from a court document. Your father left a trust. It was not large enough to be a fortune, but it was substantial enough to have changed your circumstances materially. I was named co-administrator by Drummond. I believed initially that Drummond was managing it appropriately. When I discovered he was not, when I understood the full nature of his methods, I had a choice. I could have brought the matter forward, I did not. I told myself there were reasons. I was protecting the family name from the scandal of the association. I was ensuring that what remained was properly administered rather than further eroded. I told myself you were better provided for in a stable household than you would have been with a depleted trust fund and no social guidance. I told myself many things. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not certain I deserve it, but I want you to know that nothing I told you about your prospects was intended as cruelty. I believed I was preparing you for a world that was not kind to women in your position. I believed I was protecting you from hope that had no foundation. I was wrong about the foundation. What you do with this information is your right entirely. It has always been your right. I should have told you that 3 years ago. Amelia read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the box under the floorboard, beside her father's letter. She sat for a long time. The thing she had not anticipated, the thing she had to sit with for a while before she could move, was that the letter didn't make her angrier. It made her quieter. It replaced the cold clarity of betrayal with something more complicated, the kind of complicated that doesn't resolve easily and doesn't pretend to. Millicent had been wrong. Millicent had also known she was wrong for some time, possibly from the beginning, and had constructed an elaborate internal architecture of justification that had managed to look, from the outside, exactly like practicality. That was perhaps the most honest thing about the letter. She hadn't tried to make it look like anything else. Amelia got her face. She went downstairs. Millicent was in the sitting room. She looked up when Amelia came in, and her expression was something Amelia had never seen on her aunt's face before, stripped of the careful management. Exposed in a way that proper women of Millicent's station almost never allowed themselves to be seen. Amelia said. Millicent set down her sewing. Her hands were perfectly steady. I know, I'm not withdrawing the petition. I didn't ask you to. Charlotte will need to know. For the hearing, I'll tell her. A pause. That's mine to do. Amelia stood in the doorway of the room she'd been allowed to use for 3 years. She looked at the woman who had taken her in and diminished her, and written her a letter that was, for all its failure, honest. You said I had no beauty that society valued, Amelia said. I know what I said. You were using me as an object lesson for Charlotte. Millicent's jaw tightened. Yes, and you genuinely believed every word of it. I believed most of it, a pause that had real weight in it. Parts about no man choosing you, I believed those less. You have always, she stopped. Looked away, you have always been more than I let myself say. Amelia absorbed that. It cost her something, not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of a space where forgiveness might eventually be possible. I'll be at Gerald Fairley's office this afternoon, she said. I won't be back before supper. She left. She was halfway down the front steps when she heard footsteps behind her, not Millicent's careful tread, but Charlotte's lighter, faster one. Amelia. Charlotte caught her on the bottom step. Her face was pale, which meant Millicent had told her faster than Amelia had expected. How long have you known? 5 weeks. Charlotte pressed her lips together. And you've been sitting at that supper table every night. I needed time to build the case. You needed... Charlotte made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then are you all right? Yes. Are you actually all right, or are you saying yes because you've been saying yes for 3 years, regardless of what the real answer was? Amelia looked at her cousin, at the round face and the dark curls and the genuine distress underneath them that was real and not performed. Both, Amelia said honestly. At the same time, Charlotte grabbed her hand, held it hard for a moment. Tell me what I can do. Write down everything you remember about Drummond's visits to this house. Dates if you can, who he spoke to, how long he stayed. Even small things. She squeezed Charlotte's hand back. Your memory is better for social detail than mine. It might matter. Charlotte straightened. Her distress didn't disappear, but it reorganized itself into something functional. I'll have it for you by tonight. She went back inside. Amelia continued down the steps. The thing she had not told Charlotte, and would not tell her yet, was that the letter was not the most consequential thing that had happened that morning. The most consequential thing had arrived an hour before the letter in the form of a note from Gerald Fairley. 3 lines, clean and precise as Gerald always was. Drummond has retained counsel. His counsel has contacted Magistrate Holloway's office with a motion to delay the hearing by 3 months on grounds of case complexity. Holloway is considering it. We need to be at his office this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Drummond was stalling. If the hearing was delayed, the documentation trail went cold. 2 of the affected families would enter another planting season without recovery. And the legal window for certain civil claims, she knew this because she had spent 5 weeks reading Gerald's law books in the evenings, had time limits that a 3-month delay would dangerously compress. Drummond had money. He had counsel. He had 3 months in which to continue eroding the evidence structure while presenting himself as the reasonable party awaiting orderly process. She walked to Gerald's office. She did not walk fast because walking fast suggested alarm, and she was not alarmed. She was thinking. Richard was already there when she arrived. Gerald looked between them with the expression of a man who has learned not to be surprised by anything in the past 6 weeks. Miss Ellsworth. Good. Mr. Winthrop has seen the motion. 3 months, she sat. What does Holloway need to deny it? He needs to believe the delay would cause material harm to the affected parties. Gerald spread his hands. Drummond's counsel is arguing that the complexity of the cross-estate documentation requires additional preparation time. The documentation is complex because Drummond made it complex. That's the method. She looked at Gerald. File a counter motion. Harm to ongoing agricultural operations for the affected tenant families. Specifics, names. Circumstances. The April flooding timeline for Castle's Field. The seed pricing impact on Briggs Brothers' planting decisions. Make it real people, not abstract legal complexity. Gerald was already writing. I can have it ready by tomorrow. Today, she said. At 4 o'clock when we're at Holloway's office. I want it in his hand before Drummond's count leaves the building. Gerald looked up. That's 4 hours. I know. She opened her notebook to the page she had started 3 weeks ago, which contained in her precise, compact handwriting the detailed circumstances of every tenant family connected to all 4 affected estates. Names, children, crops, the specific cost in pounds and shillings of what each family had lost or stood to lose. I've had this ready for 2 weeks. You write the legal frame. I'll supply the particulars. For the next 3 hours, Gerald Fairley's office held the specific, concentrated energy of people who understand that time is a finite resource and waste none of it. Gerald drafted. Amelia supplied the human substance that turned legal argument into something a magistrate could look at and know was real. Richard handled the cross-reference documentation from his estate files, moving between the organized stacks with the efficiency of a man who kept his own records meticulously. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was precise, a date to confirm, a figure to verify, a legal term that needed a plain language equivalent for the supporting letter they were drafting. There was something remarkable about it, though Amelia only recognized it fully afterward. 3 people in a room, working toward the same thing, each carrying their own part of it without being asked to carry more or less than they actually had. No hierarchy of importance, no performance of who was leading and who was following. Just the work. At 10 minutes to 4, Gerald held up the completed counter-motion and read the last paragraph aloud. It ended with the specific name of a 7-year-old boy on Briggs's brother's tenant plot who had been sick the previous winter, and whose family's kitchen garden would flood in April if the hearing was delayed and the recovery not processed. In time for the spring assistance fund allocation. The room was quiet. That's enough, Richard said. It's accurate, said. Every word of it. I know. That's why it's enough. They walked to the magistrate's office together. The afternoon was cool and the road was dry, and Amelia set a pace that required neither of them to slow down for her. Holloway was a rangy man in his late 50s who had the particular quality of someone who has seen enough of human nature to be genuinely impossible to impress. He read the counter-motion in front of them with Drummond's counsel, sitting 6 feet away, doing his best to look unaffected. He read it once. Then he read the section with the 7-year-old boy again. Mr. Ellsworth's estate trust. he said, looking up at Amelia. The EE Trust. Yes, sir, you're Ellsworth's daughter. I am. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man making a private accounting. Then he looked at Drummond's counsel. The motion to delay is denied. The hearing proceeds in 11 days as scheduled. He set the papers down. I'll see both parties at 9 o'clock. Drummond's counsel opened his mouth. Holloway's expression foreclosed whatever he'd been about to say. They walked out of the magistrate's office into the late afternoon. Drummond's counsel went in the other direction without looking at either of them. Gerald was already mentally composing the next document. She could tell from the way he went quiet in the focused internal manner she'd come to recognize. 11 days, Richard said. 11 days, she confirmed. They stood for a moment on the steps. The air had the cool quality of a day that had been warmer earlier and was remembering itself. You knew Holloway would respond to the specific names, he said. Magistrates are human. Abstract harm is easy to delay. Named harm is harder. She tucked her notebook under her arm. My father taught me that. He used to say that the law is built from principles, but it only moves from people. A pause. He sounds like he was a remarkable man, Richard said. He was. She looked out at the road. He also left debts and a trust that a dishonest solicitor and a frightened woman managed to disappear for 3 years, so he was not without his failures. But yes, he was remarkable. She paused. He would have liked you. She realized a half second after saying it that she had said it. The directness of it, the warmth of it. She did not take it back. Richard was quiet for a moment. When she looked at him, his expression had the quality of something careful being held. Miss Ellsworth, yeah. She said it before she'd decided to. You have helped me investigate my father's estate. Identified the fraud on it. Compelled the testimony of 4 additional affected parties. Spent 3 hours in a law office doing my document work this afternoon. And ridden across town to a magistrate's hearing on my behalf. I think we are past Miss Ellsworth. He looked at her for a long moment. Amelia, he said. Her name in his voice sounded different from how it sounded anywhere else. She filed that away. She would take it out and examine it later, in the privacy of her room, with the honesty she reserved for the things she wasn't ready to be honest about in front of other people. 11 days, she said, get some rest. She walked home alone, through the cooling afternoon, and she was almost at the door when she realized with the particular clarity that arrives when you trying to outrun a feeling that sometime in the past 6 weeks, Richard Winthrop had become something she hadn't named yet. She was going to have to name it soon. The world was about to change. She could feel it the way you feel weather not seeing it yet, but knowing in your bones it's coming. She went inside. She had 11 days. Part 4, The Woman Who Refused to be Saved. The 11 days passed the way the days before a storm passed, deceptively ordinary on the surface. Everything underneath pulled taut. Amelia spent them working. That was the only word for it. She arrived at Gerald's office before he did most mornings and was still there when the light went. She organized the evidence into a sequence that any magistrate could follow without legal training. Because Holloway was sharp, but you never assumed a sharp man had infinite patience for complexity you hadn't simplified on his behalf. She cross-referenced every figure against the original trust registration. She built a timeline of Drummond's withdrawals alongside Millicent's co-signatory activity that made the pattern visible to anyone who looked. Charlotte delivered her list of dates on the 3rd day. 12 pages, handwritten, with the specific detail of someone who had grown up observing social transactions with the precision of a naturalist. Drummond had visited the house 9 times in 3 years. Charlotte had noted what he carried, how long he stayed, which room Millicent received him in, and on 2 occasions, what she had overheard through doors that hadn't been fully closed. The overheard fragments were not conclusive by themselves. Combined with the account records, they were devastating. Amelia read through Charlotte's pages twice, then looked up. You knew something was wrong. Charlotte was sitting across the table, watching her with the careful expression she'd worn since Millicent had told her. I knew something was wrong. I didn't ask. She paused. I should have asked. You were 17 when this started. I was 19 by the time I could have asked, and it would have mattered. Charlotte held her gaze. I'm not asking you to absolve me. Good. Because that's not mine to give. Amelia folded the pages carefully. But this is, and it matters. Charlotte nodded. The conversation closed there. The way the right conversations close, not with resolution, but with honesty. Which is better? On the seventh day, Drummond made his move. It came through his counsel, who sent a document to Gerald's office that was formally titled a settlement proposal but functioned, in every practical sense, as a threat dressed in legal language. Drummond would return 40% of the documented misallocations across all four estates, except a finding of administrative irregularity rather than fraud, and the matter would be concluded without a public hearing. Gerald read it twice and then looked at Amelia over his desk with the expression of a man who already knew what she was going to say. No, she said. Miss Ellsworth, Amelia. He set the document down. 40% returned is not nothing. A finding of administrative irregularity still requires restitution. The hearing carries risk. Drummond's counsel is experienced. Holloway can be unpredictable, and if the cross-estate documentation is successfully challenged, it won't be challenged successfully. The Newcastle records establish intent. Intent is what turns administrative irregularity into fraud. She looked at him steadily. If we accept this, Drummond pays 40 cents on every dollar he stole, calls it paperwork error, and moves on to the next estate with a clean record. The two families on the Hargrove holdings who never recovered their seed allocation, they get 40% of what they were owed, and no acknowledgement that anything wrong was done to them. She paused. No. Gerald rubbed his face with both hands. You understand I have to tell you that this is a risk. You've told me I understand. She met his eyes. File the rejection. He filed it. Richard heard about the settlement offer that evening. She told him when they were reviewing the final evidence sequence at Gerald's office, the three of them had taken to meeting in the early evening, which had started as practical necessity and had become something else that none of them mentioned aloud. His reaction was not what she expected. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who has been waiting for something and has just heard it arrive. You rejected it. Of course I rejected it. Gerald advised you it carried risk. Gerald advises accurately. I chose differently. She looked at him. Do you think I was wrong? He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, thinking. There was a difference she'd learned to read. No, he said finally. But I want to make sure you made that choice with full knowledge of what happens if Holloway doesn't rule in your favor. I lose the legal claim on the remaining 60%. Drummond keeps his record clean. The other affected families have limited further recourse. She laid it out without flinching. I know exactly what I'm risking. And you're still... I'm still, she held his gaze. Some things are worth the risk of losing. Accountability for people who were robbed quietly and told they had no recourse, that's one of them. She picked up her pen. Now, the Newcastle documentation. The third transfer record has a date discrepancy that Drummond's counsel will try to exploit. We need to address it in the supporting brief before he does. They worked for another 2 hours. At some point, Gerald left a quiet exit, a murmured goodnight, the door closing with a discretion that Amelia only registered after the fact. They were alone in the office. The candles had burned lower. The evidence stacks were organized and finalized, and there was, for the first time in weeks, nothing immediate that needed doing. The silence had a different quality than working silence. Amelia. Richard's voice was careful. Careful in the specific way she'd come to recognize when he was deciding whether to say a thing, rather than whether he knew it. She waited. When this is resolved, he stopped. When the hearing is done and the recovery is processed and you have your own funds, another stop. He was a man who chose his words like a surveyor chose his stakes. What do you want? Not what will you do? Not what are your plans? What do you want? The question sat in the air between the candles and the organized stacks of evidence, and the two chairs pulled close together from weeks of working side by side. She put her pen down. I want the western field drainage fixed, she said. Not because it's mine anymore, but because 7 families live on it. She looked at her hands. I want Hennessy's boy to finish learning his letters, and then learn more after that. I want the seed pricing in Harrington County to be competitive enough that a small farmer can stay solvent without going into debt to Caldwell. She paused. I want to do something with what I know. Not be housed somewhere and kept practically comfortable in exchange for being quiet. That's what you want to build. Yes. I meant he stopped again. Something shifted in his expression. I meant, what do you want for yourself? Not just what you want to accomplish. She looked at him. Really looked at him. the way she'd been careful not to. In the same way, you're careful not to look directly at something bright until you're ready. I know what you meant, she said quietly. The silence stretched. Richard. She said his name the way she'd said it exactly twice before deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost and what it meant. I'm 4 days from a hearing that will determine whether I have independent means or not. I'm sitting in a room with evidence I've built from nothing over 6 weeks, about to face a solicitor with 20 years of experience in making documentation disappear. Whatever I feel, she stopped. Whatever I feel needs till I know I'm standing on solid ground. Because I refuse to reach for something when I don't yet know if the floor under me is real. He looked at her for a long moment. The floor is real, he said. Find that out for myself. She held his gaze. Steady. I need to know that what I stand on is mine. Not borrowed given. Mine, she paused. Do you understand that? The expression on his face was something she wanted to look at for a long time and couldn't afford to right now. He said, I understand that. She picked up her pen. They worked until the second candle burned out. The morning of the hearing arrived with the specific quality of important mornings, ordinary in its mechanics and extraordinary in its weight. Amelia dressed without ceremony. She ate the breakfast cook put in front of her. She walked to the county courthouse at 8:30, carrying her notebook and the organized evidence portfolio that Gerald had bound the previous day. Millicent was at the breakfast table when she came down. They looked at each other across the room. Millicent had aged visibly in the 11 days since the letter. Not in years, but in the way people age when they stop maintaining something. Amelia. Her voice was quiet. Aunt, whatever the outcome today, Millicent paused. You should know that I will not contest it. Amelia absorbed that. I know. And that Charlotte is not I know that too. She picked up her portfolio. Charlotte was loyal to both of us, which was an unfair position for you to put her in. She said it without cruelty. It was simply true. She left. The courthouse was a solid building that smelled of old wood and precedent. Gerald was already there, along with Richard, who stood at the back of the room as a supporting party. Rather than primary, this was her case, and he had been careful from the beginning to let it be her case. Drummond arrived with his counsel, a man named Fowler who wore his experience like armor and had the particular quality of someone who has won by attrition more times than by argument. Holloway entered at exactly 9 o'clock. The hearing began. What happened over the next 4 hours was not dramatic in the way of shouted accusations and sudden revelations. It was in the way of real legal proceedings, methodical and precise and terrifying in its restraint. Fowler opened with the complexity argument. The documentation was extensive. The cross-estate connections were speculative. The Newcastle transfer records were circumstantial rather than direct. He was measured. He was experienced. He built his case the way a man who has done this many times builds it, not fast but solid. Amelia sat beside Gerald and did not move. She listened to every word Fowler said with the same quality of attention she'd brought to the Jameson meeting and the Caldwell discussion, total, organized, filing each argument in the architecture of her response. Gerald presented their case methodically. He was good. She had known he was good, but watching him work under pressure confirmed it. Then Holloway looked at the plaintiff's table. Miss Ellsworth, you've compiled the supporting documentation. Gerald looked at her. This had not been planned. In strict procedural terms, the solicitor presented the case. A lay party did not typically address the magistrate directly. Holloway was looking at her with the expression she'd seen 11 days ago, the man who could not be impressed and was deciding something. She stood. Fowler started to object. Holloway's hand moved slightly. Fowler stopped. The discrepancy in the third Newcastle transfer record, Amelia said, because she knew he'd been looking at that. She'd seen him turn to it twice. Drummond's counsel will argue the date inconsistency creates reasonable doubt about the chain of transfer. But the inconsistency is in the recording date, not the transaction date. The transaction date matches the corresponding Drummond account withdrawal to within 48 hours, which is the standard processing window for Newcastle merchant transfers in 1815. She opened her notebook. I have the Newcastle standard processing records from 1800 and through 1817. The pattern holds consistently. Fowler was staring at her. Holloway extended his hand. She crossed to the magistrate's table and placed the records in front of him. He looked at them. For 30 seconds the room was entirely silent. The date inconsistency is addressed, Holloway said. Mr. Fowler, any response? Fowler did not have a response to that. What followed was another 90 minutes of procedural exchange that Amelia followed with the precision of someone who had read Gerald's law books for 5 weeks and understood now what the words meant. Fowler tried 3 more angles. Each one had an answer not because Amelia had planned for each specific argument, but because she had built the evidence from the ground up and she knew it the way she knew the drainage of the western fields, which was to say completely. At 12 minutes past 1, Holloway called a recess. At 30 minutes past 1, he returned. The documentation establishes a pattern of misdirection across 4 estates that is not consistent with administrative error. His voice was even. The co-signatory arrangement between Drummond and the co-administrator of the Ellsworth Trust establishes shared knowledge of that misdirection. He looked at Drummond, who had gone the color of old ash. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all primary claims. Full recovery of documented misallocations across all 4 estates is ordered within 60 days. A separate referral for criminal inquiry will be made to the county sheriff's office. The room absorbed this. Fowler began to speak. Holloway did not look at him. We're adjourned. Gerald's hand found her arm. Not dramatic, just solid. She stood still for a moment in the middle of the clearing room. Around her, the procedural machinery of the thing began its work, papers being gathered. Conversation starting in corners. Drummond and Fowler conferring in tight voices. She heard none of it. What she heard, in the strange quiet at the center of it, was her father's voice. Something he'd said to her once, when she was 12 years old and had gotten the answer right on a geometry problem that her tutor had told her was beyond her capacity. See? You always knew it. You just had to make the room quiet enough to hear yourself. Richard was beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room. You addressed Holloway directly, he said. He was looking at the date discrepancy. I had the answer. That was not standard procedure. No. She looked at the organized portfolio on the table in front of her. All those evenings. All those candles. All those pages. It worked. It worked because you knew the answer and you weren't afraid to give it. She picked up the portfolio. Her hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time. She was proud of that, and she was also, underneath the steadiness, slightly undone in the way of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a long time, and has just been told they can put it down. They walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon. Gerald was already talking with 2 of the other affected parties' representatives, making arrangements, the practical machinery moving forward. Briggs's brother was there. She hadn't known he was attending, and when he saw her fur come through the cracks was very simple and very complete. He took off his hat. She nodded to him. That was all that was needed. Richard was beside her on the courthouse steps, not close enough to be conspicuous. Close enough to be there. 60 days for full recovery, she said. Yes, that's enough time for spring planting support to reach the affected families before they need to make their seed decisions. Gerald's already thinking about the distribution structure. He should include Briggs in that conversation. And Mrs. Hennessy, the people who know what those families actually need, not just the legal figures. I'll tell him. She stood on the steps in the pale afternoon and let herself feel it, not the victory exactly, because it didn't feel like victory the way she'd imagined victory might feel. It felt more like the correction of something that had been wrong for long enough that wrong had started to seem like the natural order. You should eat something, Richard said. You had half a cup of tea this morning and nothing else. She looked at him. How do you know what I had for breakfast? Because you haven't had a full meal in 4 days, and you keep a cup of tea on your desk when you work. And I've watched you drink approximately half of it before getting distracted by a document approximately 40 times in the past month. She stared at him. You've been watching me drink my tea. I've been sitting across from you for 6 weeks. It's difficult not to notice the tea. His expression was the one that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same family as one. Come and eat something, Amelia. The case is won. The documents are filed. Eat, she went. They sat in a small tavern 2 streets from the courthouse, and she ate actual food for the first time in 4 days, and Gerald joined them after 40 minutes, and then Briggs, and the table got louder and less formal as the afternoon deepened. And at some point, Charlotte arrived. She'd been waiting 2 streets away, which was exactly the kind of thing Charlotte would do. stationed close enough to respond quickly but far enough away to give Amelia the space to walk out of that courthouse on her own first. Amelia looked at her cousin across the table. Charlotte raised her cup. Amelia raised hers. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't the absence of what had happened. It was something that might, given time and honesty, and the particular stubbornness they had both inherited from different branches of the same family, become something workable. Something real. She would take it. The evening came down gradually around the table, and the candles came on, and the noise of the tavern moved around them in the warm way of a room full of people who are not your trouble tonight. And Amelia sat in the middle of it, and was something she had not been in 3 years. She was not performing. She was just there, present. Real, herself. At some point, the table reorganized itself, Gerald into a conversation with Briggs, Charlotte into a conversation with someone who had come in from the street. Richard was beside her. The way he had been beside her for 6 weeks without fanfare or announcement. Just consistently. Reliably beside her. You said, he began. And his voice was quiet enough that the table didn't hear him. That you needed to know the floor was yours before you reached for anything. She looked at him. Is it? He asked. The honest answer assembled itself in her mind with the same precision she brought to drainage calculations and legal evidence structures and the particular mathematics of things that mattered. The trust recovery would take 60 days to process it. She would have independent means for the first time in 3 years. Not a fortune. The principal had been eroded. The misallocated disbursements were only partially recoverable, given what Drummond had already spent, but sufficient. Sufficient to stand on, sufficient to make choices from, rather than to make choices around. Was the floor hers? It's becoming mine, she said honestly. It's more mine than it's been in 3 years. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and honest and very, very direct. That's enough, he said, for now. Not a declaration, not a rush. For now. Which was exactly the right thing to say to a woman who had just spent 6 weeks building something from nothing and needed, above all things, to not have someone try to rush her toward the next thing before this one had fully settled. She looked at him for a long moment. Richard. She said his name the way she had learned to say it, with full knowledge and without apology. You have been beside this case from the beginning, without putting yourself at the center of it. You have asked what I needed rather than telling me what you were offering. You have watched me drink approximately half a cup of tea 40 times without making me feel managed. She paused. That is not nothing. No, he agreed, it's not. I'm going to need time, I know. Not because I'm uncertain. She needed him to understand this distinction. But because certainty deserves the respect of being named correctly, at the right moment, when I'm standing in the right place. He looked at her for a moment that had real weight to it. Then he nodded. Not with impatience, with the particular kind of regard that understands waiting and does not find it beneath itself. Whenever you're ready, he said. I'll be here. She looked back at the table. At Charlotte and Gerald and Briggs and the candles. At the specific, improbably of people who had become, in 6 weeks, the kind of people you look around a table and recognize as yours. The floor was becoming real beneath her feet. She intended to stand on it properly before she did anything else. But she was standing. For the first time in 3 years, she was standing. Part 5. The woman who was finally chosen. The 60 days did not pass quietly. Nothing in Amelia Ellsworth's life had passed quietly since the night she'd taken Richard Winthrop's hand on the assembly floor. And she had stopped expecting quiet, the way you stop expecting a particular kind of weather after you've lived somewhere long enough to know it doesn't come. The trust recovery moved through its legal mechanics with the grinding precision of county court process forms. Confirmations. Countersignatures. A brief and unsuccessful challenge from Drummond's counsel that Holloway dismissed in 4 sentences. The criminal referral to the sheriff's office produced, in its 3rd week, the news that Drummond had been found to have misallocated funds across not 4 estates but 7. The additional 3 having come forward once the original ruling made the precedent visible. He was quiet about it, which was the only quality Amelia could genuinely respect in him. He did not try to run, did not try to further obscure, simply went quiet and let the process take him. Caldwell's seed pricing structure collapsed 2 weeks after the hearing, not from legal pressure, but from the Newcastle import arrangement that Richard had quietly finalized through his northern contact. When Harrington County farmers found they could purchase primary grain seed at 12% below Caldwell's rate, the market recalibrated itself with the swift impersonal logic of markets. Caldwell sent a letter to Gerald's office that was technically civil and functionally furious. Gerald read it, noted its receipt, and filed it. Briggs's brother planted his spring crop with full seed allocation for the first time in 3 years. Hennessy's boy finished his letters in the 4th week after the hearing and wrote his name, Tobias James Hennessy, in careful block print at the bottom of a page that Amelia folded and kept in the box under the floorboard, beside her father's letter and Millicent's and Charlotte's 12 pages of dates. She found a house. It was small, 2 rooms on the upper floor of a solid building on Marsh Street, with the parlor below that could serve as a working space, and a kitchen that had seen better decades but was structurally honest. She paid the first quarter's rent from her own money, the first disbursement from the recovered trust having cleared on the 43rd day of the 60-day window. Gerald had looked at the lease document before she signed it. Richard had not been consulted because it was not his to consult on. She moved in on a Tuesday morning with 2 trunks and the box from under the floorboard and a feeling in her chest that she could not name immediately, and then did. She felt large. Not physically, in herself. The way you feel when you've been in a small space for a long time and suddenly have room to breathe through your whole body. Charlotte helped her move the trunks. They didn't talk much during it, which was fine. The talking had been done in the 3 weeks between the hearing and the move honest. Difficult. Not comfortable and not supposed to be comfortable. About what had happened and what Charlotte had known and what she hadn't and what the future of them looked like now. They hadn't resolved everything, because some things don't resolve in 3 weeks or 3 years. But they had established the particular kind of honesty between them that 2 people can build on, which was enough to move trunks together without needing to fill the silence. "It's a good room," Charlotte said, standing in the upper parlor and looking around with the eye of someone who has spent her life assessing spaces for their social potential and is now trying to see a different kind of potential. "It's a real room, it's mine," Amelia said simply. Charlotte looked at her. Something moved across her face that was complicated and real, and exactly what Amelia needed to see, not pity, not relief, not the careful managed emotion of social performance. "Just her cousin being present, yes," Charlotte said quietly. "It is." She left an hour later. Amelia stood alone in the upper room of her own house and listened to the particular silence of a space that belongs to you, which is different from any other silence there is. She had been standing there, perhaps 20 minutes, when the knock came at the street door below. She went down. She opened it. Richard Winthrop stood on her doorstep. Not with flowers. She had privately decided she would have found that slightly wrong, too practiced. Not with any social prop at all. Just himself. Coat dusty from the road. Hat in his hand. Looking at her with the direct, unhurried gaze she had come to know better than she'd intended. "I heard you moved in today. Charlotte told you." "Charlotte told me." He paused. "I wasn't going to come. I was going to give you a week." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, it's the presence of something being organized carefully before it's said. "I've been patient," he said. "I'm not sorry for it. You needed what you needed, and I understood that, and I meant every word I said in the tavern about waiting." He held her gaze. "But I have been sitting with something for weeks that I should have said at the Jameson meeting and didn't say at Morton's, and almost said at the courthouse steps, and kept not saying, because the timing wasn't right, or the floor wasn't solid, or there was always one more thing to resolve first." He stopped. "There's no more things, Amelia. The case is done. The trust is recovered. You have your house. The floor is solid." His voice didn't waver. "And I would like to tell you what I should have told you 6 weeks ago, if you'll let me." She stood in the doorway of her own house on her own floor that was solid and entirely hers. "Come in," she said. She made tea. It was a practical thing to do with her hands while he settled into the chair across from the small table she'd arranged by the window. She did not make half a cup. She made a full pot and she brought it to the table, and she sat down and she looked at him. He didn't stall. "The night at the assembly," he began, I came across the room because I'd spent 40 minutes watching a woman who had more intelligence in the way she observed a room than most men I've worked with have in their entire professional conduct. And I was struck by it. But I told myself it was interest. Professional curiosity, he paused. Then you told me about the creel stream diversion. The 20-foot eastern adjustment. And I thought, here is someone who knows real things. Who has carried real knowledge through circumstances that should have crushed it out of her and kept it intact anyway. That's not professional curiosity, that's something else. She didn't move. She listened. At the Jameson meeting, when Cassell gave you his seat, or rather when I made him, I told you it was because you'd walked too far to stand. That was true. He set his hat on the table. It was also true that I couldn't sit across that table and watch you stand on the periphery of a conversation you were more equipped to lead than anyone in the room. That was the moment I understood I wasn't going to be neutral about you. That whatever this was, it was not going to stay at a comfortable distance if I was honest about it. The tea sat between them, steaming. At Morton's gathering. When you laughed at the idea that I'd been attending these things reluctantly for 3 years, I want to be specific, Amelia. Because you appreciate specificity, that was the moment I stopped telling myself it was professional interest. His voice was steady. Not rehearsed, just honest. The way he was honest about everything without ornamentation. It took me another week to admit that to myself, and another week after that to understand what to do with it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. It was warm, real solid. And then you found the ledger, he said. And you came to Gerald, and you built a case from nothing in 6 weeks that won a ruling I'd been trying to get Drummond into court over for 3 months through other means. He paused. I've worked with advisors who've been doing this work for 20 years who couldn't have done what you did with that evidence structure. You're telling me I'm competent, she said, not quite wry but adjacent to it. That's your declaration. No. His expression shifted into something more direct. My declaration is that I have been falling in love with you since the Jameson meeting, and I have been aware of it clearly since Morton's, and I have been trying to do right by your need to stand on your own ground for 6 weeks, and now you are. Standing on your own ground, and I am telling you, he met her eyes without flinching. I love who you are, not who you could be made into. Not the version of you that fits a particular frame. The version that shows up to meetings she wasn't invited to and gives magistrates Newcastle processing records from memory and spends Thursday afternoons teaching tenant boys to read and refuses settlement offers. On principle, even when the risk is real, he paused. That woman specifically. The room held the weight of it. Amelia looked at him, at the honest, dusty hat on the table reality of him sitting across from her in her own parlor. On the first day, it was her own parlor. She thought of 3 years of being told what she lacked. She thought of the assembly wall, and the Jameson table, and the magistrate's office, and the tavern afterward, and 60 days of a case, resolving itself while something else, slower and realer, resolved alongside it. She thought of her father's voice. You always knew it. You just had to make the room quiet enough to hear yourself. You rode 40 minutes across Harrington to tell me that, she said. It's not far. You rode 300 miles to find me when I was going to leave, she said it quietly. Not as accusation. As fact to fact, she was naming aloud for the first time. Because she'd known. She'd known the moment Gerald told her, 3 weeks ago, about the inquiry he'd been running for 3 months before their cases intersected. She'd known what it meant that he'd been looking into Drummond's practices long before a woman at an Encasbly mentioned a creel stream diversion. She'd known, and she'd needed the floor to be solid first. He went still. You came to the assembly, she said, because someone mentioned the Western Fields, and you were already running an investigation into Drummond, and my family name appeared in his records, and you came to find out what I knew. She held his gaze. How long had you been looking at Drummond before that night? 3 months, his voice was careful. I found discrepancies in 2 other estate administrations he'd handled. I traced the pattern back. Your father's trust appeared in the same records. He paused. I wasn't Amelia. I came to the assembly because you appeared in those records, yes. But the moment you said, no man will choose you, in the way you said it, not to me, to yourself, in the way you held your glass that had nothing to do with Drummond. She sat with that. You could have told me, she said. I know. He didn't flinch from it. I should have told you sooner. I convinced myself that you needed to find the ledger yourself, that if I led you to it, it would undermine your standing in the case. That's true as far as it goes. It's also true that I was afraid if I walked up to you and said your trust exists and your family's solicitor has been stealing from it. Before we'd had any real conversation, you would have had every reason to see me as someone trying to manage you. To rescue you, he paused. And I knew from the moment you told me about the Creel stream at the assembly that you did not want to be rescued. The silence between them had real texture. You were right about that, she said. I know. It doesn't entirely excuse the withholding. I know that too. He held her gaze without deflection. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to know that every decision I made, right or wrong, was made with you at the center of it. Not me, not the case you. Amelia was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the tea cooled another degree, and the afternoon moved slightly, and a cart went past on the street below, and the sound of it filtered up through the floor of her own house. Her own house. She thought about what it meant to be angry at someone for protecting you from the wrong kind of help. She thought about what it meant to understand a person well enough to know their failure was the wrong application of the right instinct. She thought about Gerald's expression in that first meeting when she'd given him ledger figures from memory, and Richard's face when she'd told him about the Creel stream, and Holloway reading the Newcastle records she'd placed in front of him, and Briggs's brother taking off his hat outside the courthouse. She thought about what it meant to have been seen, truly seen. Not despite the inconvenient, stubborn, too knowledgeable, refusing the wrong offers parts of herself, but because of them. Richard. Her voice was steady. Her hands on the teacup were steady. She sitting in her own parlor on her own floor, entirely herself. Not performing, not smaller than she was, not waiting to be permitted. I am going to tell you something, and I need you to understand it is not uncertainty, and it is not qualification. He waited. I have been in love with you since Morton's gathering, she said. When you laughed the real laugh, not the contained one, and 3 people turned to look and you didn't care. She met his eyes. I knew then. I made myself wait because the ground wasn't mine yet, and I didn't trust that what I felt wasn't just gratitude or relief or loneliness wearing a more presentable face. She paused. It isn't any of those things. I know what those feel like. This is different. The expression on his face was something she hadn't seen before, not the careful recalibration, not the controlled assessment, not the professional attention she'd spent 6 weeks learning to read. Something unguarded, something that had been waiting behind the steadiness for a long time. Amelia, he said. I am also, she continued, because she needed to finish it cleanly, going to require that whatever this becomes, it becomes between 2 people who are honest with each other, even when honesty is inconvenient. You withheld the Drummond connection. That cannot be the pattern. It won't be. I need that to be a real commitment, not a reassurance. I know the difference between those things. His voice was direct. So do you. That's why I'm not just saying yes, I'm saying yes because I understand exactly what you're asking for and I'm prepared to give it. All of it. The difficult conversations and the inconvenient truths and every piece of information that's relevant to your life and your choices. He held her gaze. You have my word, she believed him. Not because it was easy to believe, but because she'd spent 6 weeks watching how he operated under pressure, how he handled information, how he treated people with less power than himself, and how he responded when he was wrong. A person's character is not visible in how they behave when things are simple. It's visible in exactly those 6 weeks she'd had. She trusted what she'd seen. Good, she said. She poured fresh tea. They sat together in the afternoon in her own parlor and talked not about the case, not about estates or drainage or seed pricing or magistrates, but about the things people talk about when they have decided to stop managing the distance between themselves. About her father and the honor he had treated, and what it had felt like to be 12 years old and write about something everyone told her was beyond her. About his grandfather's northern land and the particular stubborn pride of a family that had built something real and never entirely trusted that it was allowed to stay real. About what she wanted to build the school she'd been thinking about, attached to the legal aid fund she'd discussed with Gerald. Serving the tenant families who had no recourse when the people in power over them decided that the law was for other people. A school and the legal fund. They're connected. Children who learn to read can eventually read contracts. People who understand their legal rights are harder to defraud. She paused. It's not charitable work in the way people usually mean charitable work. It's infrastructure. He looked at her with that expression she had finally sitting in her own houses, on her own floor, allowed herself to fully see. I have a building, he said, on the western property. Empty for 2 years. It was a grain store before the drainage issue made the lower field unusable. She stared at him. You're offering me a building. I'm telling you a building exists. What you do with the information is up to you. She held his gaze for a moment, then she laughed. Not the polite social laugh she'd developed over 3 years of standing at walls. The real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine and didn't consult anyone before it arrived. He looked at her when she laughed the way she suspected she looked at him when he did it. Show me the building, she said. They went that afternoon. Not in any formal arrangement. She simply put on her coat and they walked to the western property together in the cooling afternoon. And he showed her a solid, honest, empty building with good walls and a sound roof and enough floor space for 12 children and their letters and their futures. She walked its length. She stood in the middle of it. She looked up at the ceiling, which was high enough, and then down at the floor, which was solid. The Creel Stream diversion, she said. If we redirect it 20 feet east in the spring, the lower field becomes usable again. I know. The drainage fix should happen before the school opens. Otherwise the building gets damp in the south corner. She pointed. There, you've been in this building 4 minutes. I know which direction south is. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway, not filling it, not blocking it, just occupying it the way he occupied most spaces, with the easy, unhurried presence of a man who doesn't need to dominate a room to be entirely himself in it. Richard, ask me. He was still for a moment. Then he pushed off from the doorframe and crossed to where she stood in the middle of the building that smelled of old grain and future possibilities, and he looked at her with everything unguarded and entirely present. Would you do me the honor, he said, of becoming the kind of woman who is legally and publicly connected to me, so that the next time someone tells you no man will choose you, I am standing beside you as the very specific refutation of that claim. It was not the most formally correct proposal. It was, however, exactly right. Yes, she said. Simply, clearly, with full knowledge of what she was standing on and what she was reaching for and what the difference was between being saved and being chosen. He took her hand. Not the way he'd taken it at the assembly, correctly choreographed the structure of a dance. He just took it. His hand around hers in the empty building on the property where she'd grown up, where her father's drainage solution had run for 6 years before it silted, where 7 families were about to stop worrying about April flooding. They stayed there a long time. The wedding was in late spring, when the Creel Stream diversion had been redirected 20 feet east and the south corner of the building was dry, and the school had its first 6 students, including Tobias James Hennessy, who was learning arithmetic now, having finished letters the previous winter. Charlotte stood beside Amelia. Gerald Fairley was there, looking less harried than she'd ever seen him, which she attributed to the fact that Drummond's criminal proceeding had concluded satisfactorily and 3 of the 7 affected families had received full recovery. Briggs's brother sat in the 3rd row with his hat in his hands and his oldest boy beside him. An old friend of Richard's, a man named Hartley, who had known him since his northern years and who had the weathered quality of someone who'd watched him operate for a long time, pulled him aside before the ceremony and asked the question that the room had been circling around for months. Of all the women, Hartley said, not unkindly, just genuinely curious. Why her? Richard looked across the room to where Amelia was talking with Charlotte, not performing, not managing the social architecture, just talking, the way she talked when she forgot to be careful, which was increasingly all the time. She had her hands moving the way they did when she was working through a problem, and Charlotte was laughing at something she'd said, and she was entirely herself in the middle of a room full of people, without a single edge folded under. Because everyone else, Richard said, looked at what she didn't have. I was the first person who looked at what she was carrying. He paused. And what she was carrying was more than most people build in a lifetime. Hartley looked at Amelia across the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way men nod when they've understood something true, and went to find his seat. Amelia caught Richard's eye across the room. Whatever she saw in his expression, that unguarded, wholly present thing she'd been looking at since her own parlor, made her stand up straighter. Not performing, not smaller. Just herself, standing on solid ground. Looking at the person who crossed a room and then ridden through rain and mud and 300 miles of difficult road. Not to save her, but because he couldn't imagine a world in which he didn't know her. She walked toward him, not waiting to be led, not managing the distance. Just walking across the room the way she walked into every room now, like she meant to be there, like the ground under her feet was hers, like she had never once in her life believed the words her aunt had spoken over her breakfast table, like a verdict. The school opened its doors that same week. The Legal Aid Fund accepted its first case the month after. The Western Field, with its redirected drainage and its repaired channel, produced a full harvest in the autumn that brought Cassell to Gerald's office to formally request Amelia's consultation, which Gerald delivered with the specific professional neutrality of a man, concealing a great deal of satisfaction. She was thorough. She was paid. She never stood at the edge of a wall again. Not because no one ever tried to put her there, they did, occasionally, because the world is full of people who are most comfortable with women, arranged at its periphery, but because she had learned, in the particular school of the previous year, what it cost to stay there and what it felt like to step away from it, and she had made her choice about which cost she was willing to pay. The small box from under the floorboards sat on the shelf above her writing desk in the house on Marsh Street, which she kept through the marriage because it was hers, and Richard had never suggested otherwise. Inside it, her father's letter, and Millicent's, and Charlotte's 12 pages of dates, and Tobias Hennessy's name, written in block print at the bottom of a page. She added things to it over the years. A letter from the second student at the school who went on to become a land manager, the first in his family to earn a wage that didn't come from tenant labor. Copy of the Legal Aid Fund's charter. A note from Gerald, brief and characteristic, on the occasion of their 5th year of operation, that said only, the Drummond precedent was cited in a Bristol case this week. It held, GF, she kept them all, because a woman who has been told she is nothing learns, when she finally understands what she carries, to keep the evidence of it carefully. To know it is real, to hold it where she can find it in the dark. Amelia Ellsworth had carried more than anyone saw. She had always known it. She simply needed the room to be quiet enough to hear herself, and now it was.